start by thanking you all for attending tonight's session on divestment. I know that it's hard to feel it when we are connected only by Wi-Fi, but I find it incredibly heartening and energizing to know that we are all here tonight because we all want to take action and work together to make a safer future for our children and for all of us. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce Caroline Dunny to offer a land acknowledgement. And we are just going to get Carolyn up on the screen here.
Thank you, Brienne. Let us all take a moment to acknowledge the land we're on. On this Zoom, we're all from different regions of indigenous lands, too numerous to name here. I invite you right now to click on the link in the chat, which will take you to a website called nativeland.ca. For the next few moments, I would like you to find out what Indigenous territory you're on by either entering your location in the upper left corner or move on the map. The website is Indigenous created and run. We acknowledge that most of us here are white settlers on Turtle Island, and that as settlers we have a role to play as conscientious guests. We acknowledge that our Indigenous hosts were and continue to be the original advocates to the land we stand on. It is especially important to acknowledge Indigenous land defenders as we come together to discuss divestment, as they are often the ones on the front lines protecting the land and people from fossil fuel infrastructure, and often at great cost to their personal safety. We acknowledge the Wet'suwet'en people who are currently defending the land from the ongoing threat of the Coastal GasLink pipeline, the very real and traumatic impacts of the fossil fuel industry, particularly on Indigenous communities, underscores the urgency of divestment and our discussion tonight. In this moment, we acknowledge that we are guests, and we say thank you to our hosts and offer our help in being better stewards to the land.
Thank you, Carolyn. So I'll start with some introductions. I'll start with introducing Galen Armstrong. Galen is an organizer with 4 kids, but tonight he will be wearing a different hat doing tech support for us. So thank you very much, Galen, to make sure that everything runs smoothly tonight. I'd like to welcome our presenters. Adam Scott is the Director of Shift Action for Pension Wealth and Planet Health. He has more than 15 years experience in climate policy, energy, finance, and campaign design. Tonight he will share how our pensions are funding fossil fuels and how we can take action to shift our retirement savings out of climate destruction and into climate solutions. Matt Lie-Paehlke is the co-founder of Climate Pledge Collective, a group designed to help ordinary people get involved in climate action. Matt is currently running the Bank Switch campaign, and we are very much looking forward to hearing his presentation on Canadian banks, banking alternatives, and how we can work together to pressure our banks to adopt climate-safe policies. Lella Bloomer is an organizer with 4 kids and lifelong activist with 30 years of experience working in the nonprofit sector. Tonight, she will offer her thoughts and experiences on the kinds of collective action we can take to defund fossil fuels. Thank you to all of you for being with us tonight and sharing your experience and expertise. We are so grateful for your time and energy. Just take a moment here. Okay, so we welcome you to engage with us and ask questions throughout the next hour and 15 minutes, but we will be waiting to address those questions during our Q&A session at the end. You can pose your questions by asking them in the chat, which you will find at the bottom bar of your browser if you are on a computer, or at the top right once you click on More, those little dots are. You can also use this function to communicate with Galen to get tech support at any time. In terms of our agenda tonight, we will get started in just a minute with a presentation by Adam Scott of Shift Action for Pension Wealth and Planet Health. Then we will move on to a presentation by Matt Lie-Paehlke of Climate Pledge Collective, followed by a brief discussion by Lilo Bloomer of For Our Kids. And finally, we will close our webinar with a Q&A, including all three of our presenters with your questions submitted throughout the evening. And this webinar will be recorded and posted on our website for later viewing. And with that, I will pass the mic, so to speak, to Adam Scott.
Great, thanks, Brianne. Thanks for having me come speak. It's really great to be invited out. As a parent of young children and as a longtime climate activist, I'm a very big fan of For Our Kids and the network and all the work you're doing. So it's really great to get to come and speak to you. So I'm going to try to run through a couple of things here. We're going to set the context for this conversation quickly by just a brief review of the climate science and how it directly links into this conversation around divestment and reinvestment. And then we'll talk a little bit about our work at Shift, which is focusing on a really effective way of engaging on climate is to push pension funds, Canada's largest pension funds, around getting out of fossil fuels and moving into solutions. So we'll touch on that, and I'll try to be very brief as I can. So we'll just dive right in, and please feel free to hold questions till afterward. We'll have lots of room for discussion, and I'm sure I can answer any questions that come up. Oh, I'm going to also share my slides because that would be important. There we go. So now you can see, I hope.
Yep, looks great.
Great, you can see it. Yeah, so, this is a review for a lot of folks, but I always find it's very important to make sure we're putting the conversation around climate change in the proper context, and to remember what the science of climate says about what's happening and what we need to do about it. And so just to that end, I'll just blow through a couple of slides here, but this slide sums up the concentration of CO2, the most significant of the sort of 6 primary greenhouse gases, and its increase in our atmosphere in 60%, by 60% in just a very short period of time. So you can see this is actually observed increasing every year steadily, and it continues to into 2020 as well. And this increase in greenhouse gas emissions is the direct result of combustion of fossil fuels, which have been dug up from the ground. And we're talking specifically about gas, crude oil, and coal. And it's not the only cause of the increase in emissions and the changed climate, but it's the overwhelming primary contributor is the combustion of fossil fuels. And here you can see that increase in combustion of those fuels directly correlates to the increase in atmospheric CO2. And here's the implication of that. The increase of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere are trapping heat at greater levels and changing the balance of heat in our atmosphere. This is clear and measurable, and we're seeing warming, pretty dramatic warming. And this has impacts into all of our connected climatic systems around the world. And this gets very complicated, but this is a very quick, brief review that shows just how incredibly important it is to focus on the role of fossil fuel combustion in the crisis we're facing. This is what's happening as a result of the warming we're already seeing. We're seeing significant, countless impacts today, and we're seeing an increased likelihood of wildfires, floods, heat waves, droughts, sea level rise, extreme weather, all of which damage the systems and infrastructure that underpin our economy. They harm people, they harm our health, and they harm ecosystems as well. And these photos are just a couple of recent examples of how climate crisis is causing direct harm from the burning of fossil fuels. So, top left there, that's Hurricane Harvey flooding Houston, unprecedented ways. The top right there is an image from Cape Town, South Africa, a place that I visited during the peak of a drought, which actually saw the city basically run out of drinking water, water of all types. It's the first major global city to actually run out of water, which had devastating impacts on the economy and on people there. The bottom left is a case from Canada. That's the Columbia Glacier, which is actually a source of of water for much of the driest parts of the Canadian prairies in the Saskatchewan River Basin. And it's rapidly retreating and is expected to disappear, perhaps in the scope of my lifetime. And the bottom right there shows Fort McMurray during the wildfires a couple of years back. But, I think all of us are very aware of the deepening and worsening wildfire seasons we're having in the north and in the south of the planet every year. So we can sort of feel these impacts, and these are having very real and measurable impacts economically, which we'll talk about again in a second. And of course, this is all very scary to review when we're talking about climate change. And so it's important to realize that there is a path out of this. There's a path out of runaway climate change, but it's not often talked about enough. So we have no choice but to cut off the root source of the problem, and that's primary fossil fuel combustion, along with land use changes like deforestation and industrial emissions. But first and foremost, we must transition our energy systems to zero carbon as quickly as possible. And this graph, more than any other that I use in my work, shows what that trajectory looks like today. And it's pretty sobering. It's a bit of a difficult graph to digest because it shows what's needed to achieve a 1.5 degree stabilization of global temperatures. So the black line there on the left shows historical emissions. And you can see we are currently sort of at the top there in 2020. And you can see that there's an opportunity cost to delay. Had we started taking action in 2020, the curve we would have needed to take to get down to zero would have been quite gentle and manageable. And every year we've delayed, the curve has gotten steeper. So we're now facing nearly a brick wall, a requirement to reduce emissions incredibly quickly. And there are sort of two takeaways I want you to sort of picture here. One is we're not aiming to reduce emissions. That's not the goal of effective climate policy. We're aiming to eliminate them completely. So we're actually headed for zero emissions. And the 1.5 degree threshold, which is the basis of the Paris Agreement, is actually requires us to basically have global emissions in 15 years and hit zero in 30. So that's an incredibly unprecedented short timeline and difficult thing. And so I want to make sure that we're having this conversation in the context of the speed and seriousness of what's required. So we're going to have a conversation about finance, about institutions making investment decisions. This is the context that's not often brought up enough. And I just wanted to underline that for you. So obviously a transition of this magnitude can't just come from government policy tweaking around the edges. Can't just come from government. It has to come from everywhere. And it has to come from a shift in where capital is invested in our society, as well as decisions made by government. So that's why finance institutions, banks, investors, pension funds, they're all critical to actually achieving what we need to achieve here. And that means dramatic change in how they operate and invest. So I'm going to run quickly through, well, put this in context. The divestment conversation is primarily been rooted in a moral case for a long time, for good reason. It is a moral case. There's a strong moral case for divestment, and it started as a symbolic shift, and it's moved and evolved over time. And we're now in a place where we can very clearly make strong financial arguments for divestment. And in fact, this is an incredibly important part of ensuring that institutions and individuals are divesting, because they're required to make what we call fiduciary responsibility arguments. They're actually, a lot of the decision makers around finance and investment are required to make the most money possible. And it's very easy now in 2020 to say divestment is the best financial choice. It's the best way to protect investment over the long haul, and it's the best way to grow it as well. So we'll talk more about that. So here's a quick tour of the many ways in which climate change directly negatively impacts the economy and finances of different companies. So these are the negative economic impacts of climate change. I'm just going to blow through them. I have a bunch of slides, and I normally do a much longer talk on this, so I won't dwell on them. Some of this will be quite obvious, I think, to many of you. the physical risks of climate change are fairly obvious. Physical risks to infrastructure from fires, floods, heat waves, droughts, sea level rise, and extreme weather, and damage to infrastructure. Disruption to supply chains, food chains, and that sort of thing. So a lot of companies are actually facing unbelievable physical risks to their operations from climate change today. And I can give examples that we'll just blast through. Second category is transition risk. And this is a very, also fairly obvious to many people, but companies can be disrupted by rapid changes in technology and other trends in their sector. And so this slide shows some quick examples of some sectors that you might have thought of that have been disrupted over the years. Blockbuster video being disrupted by Netflix. I really like the case of Kodak Film, the world's largest filmmaker, actually was involved in selling digital cameras, but was quickly disrupted by smartphones. So you can sort of see that there are lots of examples of dramatic financial transitions where the company, it wasn't a linear transition. It wasn't a slow decline of those businesses. It was an overnight put out of business sort of situation. And that's where fossil fuels find themselves today. And I'm going to walk quickly through why. We're seeing an unbelievable, unprecedented decline in the cost of clean energy technologies today. And this is very, very good news, given that we need to deploy these technologies at scale immediately. So this is the unbelievable decline in the cost of solar power. Solar power is now competing with wind power for the cheapest possible form of new electricity globally. And I think the International Energy Agency just crowned solar as the cheapest form of energy in history. So it's now become the most competitive, cheapest to install form of energy generation. Battery storage is another quick example. The costs are dropping at the same rate. We're very quickly seeing batteries that are put in things like electric cars, meaning dropping in price so quickly that electric vehicles will soon be cheaper than internal combustion engines. And you can imagine the implications that has for the oil industry. So there are many more examples of disruption, and I could spend a whole hour long talking about the ways in which that happens. But just to think that divestment, if you're thinking around the frame of shifting money out of companies like fossil fuels, you have to be thinking there's a strong risk to those companies that they could lose their value very substantially. So these are some of the core sort of fundamental arguments around divestment from a financial perspective. Companies that are involved in high emission sectors are also hugely exposed to policy and regulation. As we see, governments have been too slow to do this, but they are ramping up regulation. So we're seeing carbon pricing, internal combustion engine phase outs, retrofits for buildings, phasing out coal. We hope to see a lot more of this. And that will actually have big negative implications for a number of different sectors, primarily coal, oil, and gas. Coal is already being phased out rapidly, not rapidly enough, but it's really picking up speed now, and that industry is actually largely collapsing, particularly in the global north at the moment. So I can just keep moving. There's also a final category here of legal and reputational risk. You can think about fossil fuel companies today very much like we might have thought of tobacco companies in the 1990s. These are companies that have lied to the public intentionally and spent billions of dollars in actively blocking action on climate change to protect their own private interest. And there's documentation of this, and there have been a number of legal challenges picking up over time. So if we really want to not invest in companies that face these substantial risks on their books, divestment's a very good strategy. And finally, I think this is a compelling argument that's not often made enough. If you're an investor and you have a portfolio and you're trying to grow it over time, so I'm going to talk about pensions in a moment, but if you're a long-term investor, you have to think about the long-term implications of not doing anything. And when it comes to climate change, not acting as aggressively as possible to address this crisis will cost you more than acting every time. And this category of risk is not often foreseen. But if we don't succeed in stabilizing global temperatures fairly quickly, there's no area of the economy that's safe from the negative impacts of climate change. It's a headwind to GDP growth everywhere, every industry, every form of demand, because we're seeing cascading, rippling effects damaging parts of the economy everywhere. And a good example where you can sort of feel that coming into play is the bushfires that happened last year, actually started out about this time last year in Australia over their summer. It actually quite substantially damaged all of Australian GDP that year. And you can imagine that kind of cascading impact from different climate impacts around the world if we're not able to get this under control. So we're not going to be able to grow pensions for people who are just starting out working now. If you want to be sure of retiring one day, if your pension fund isn't actively participating in solving the climate crisis, they're exposing you to portfolio risks. Yeah, and finally, I think, I want to skip over this too quickly, but it's important to mention there's a way of growing investment, and that's investing in the winners of that transition we just talked about. So if you're on the renewable energy side and energy storage and electric vehicles and public transit and building efficiency and a number of different sectors that are part of the solution to climate change, part of this rapid energy transition we need to see, there is substantial growth. There's a really good news story here. So if you're an investor, shifting your finances, your investments into these sectors is the way you're going to get exponential growth over time. It is the way that you're going to be looking out for the best interests of your beneficiaries. So increasingly, groups of people who are pushing their pension funds, their university endowments, lots and lots of areas where you're finding divestment campaigns, they're able to make very clear and compelling arguments that not only divestment, but reinvestment into climate solutions is what they need to be doing. And there's lots of examples, and I won't have time to go through them all, but these are utilities in Europe that invested in renewable energy versus those that didn't over since 2014, so the last 6 years. And you can see there's an outperforming trend across all sectors. And since COVID-19 has hit, the renewable energy sector is the only sector pretty much, other than some healthcare areas, that's gone up very dramatically. So finally, I want to just quickly point out on the fossil fuel side that fossil fuels have underperformed the market over the last 10 years. We have clear data that shows had you divested any time, basically since 2010, across a broad portfolio of fossil fuel companies, your returns would have been better than had you held on to them. They've underperformed substantially, and this is the S&P 500 energy sector index has barely grown at all over the last chunk. And this slide actually predates COVID-19, so I can imagine it's worse than this now. So it's pretty easy to make a compelling financial argument to complement the moral arguments of divestment and reinvestment right now. I've spoken a lot. I'm just going to briefly talk a little bit about what Shift is doing. We're really trying to shift the largest pieces of capital in Canada, and that's Canada's public pension funds, or you can look more broadly to private pension funds as well. But Canada's 10 largest pension funds have over $1.5 trillion in assets under management. They're the largest investors of any kind collectively, and they're hugely influential. They own huge pieces of the real economy around the world. They're influential to the other areas of the financial sector, like banks, like insurance companies, and they really they own whole companies. So they really drive the way that the world moves. And so actually getting pension funds to phase out, to divest, to say no new investments in fossil fuels and to phase out their existing holdings, and to shift billions of dollars in capital rapidly into climate solutions is an essential piece of this puzzle. All Canadians are members of at least one pension fund. If you're in English Canada, you're part of the Canada Pension Plan at a bare minimum. If you're in Quebec, you're part of the Quebec Pension Plan, which is administered by the Caisse de dépôt. And many Canadians are part of others. And you have a lot of power to push your pension fund to divest and to reinvest as well. So Shift is here to help Canadians make that engagement easy and smooth, and to give you the tools you need to push your pension fund. And so that's what we're here, and we can talk more about that in the discussion. But as a first starting move, we actually have an action tool on our website. If you go to shiftyourpension.ca, you can actually send a letter directly to your pension fund today by filling out the information of which pension fund you're part of. And you can engage directly with your pension fund, asking them difficult questions and pushing them aggressively. And we do think that this is a path to moving that capital in a way that'll help us solve this crisis.
And if I could just insert Adam for a second, we do have a poll here about pension funds and maybe which you belong to. So if you'd like to sort of participate, it'd be interesting to get some live data on which pension funds we are beneficiaries of in this talk tonight.
Yeah, it's really helpful to know where people are and what pension fund they're part of. One thing I can say while we're quickly doing the poll is none of the Canadian pension plans are leading on this issue. The Caisse de dépôt in Quebec is the only pension fund in Canada that has sort of set a net zero target and some meaningful concrete steps, but they still have a very dirty, high carbon portfolio. And none of the other pension funds they have substantial investments in coal, gas, and oil, often larger than they should have for their sector. And they've been very resistant to discussions that we've had. So they talk a lot about responsible investing, and they talk about all sorts of sort of technical aspects of this, but where the rubber hits the road, they have not substantially taken action to align their investment strategies with the goals of a safe climate. And that's what we're here to push them on. So yeah, we can talk more about details in the comments, but I want to make sure we kick it back. We have time for other speakers here. Yeah, and this slide, you can see the websites we have. We have a specific action tool as well for Ontario teachers at Shift OTPP. If you want to reach out to us and ask any more specific questions, we'd love to chat with you, info@shiftaction.ca. But I'll leave you with this one slide, which I like to show sometimes, which a lot of personal actions have on climate change have a lot of impact. But if you have a large portfolio of investments that's sort of broadly invested, there's a substantial carbon footprint to your investments. And it's really important to think about what that is and to actively move to get your investments into zero carbon investments any way you can. It's really a substantial way of working on climate change that a lot of Canadians haven't yet thought of or engaged with. So I urge you to sort of move in that direction, and we can talk more about how to do that. Thanks. That was a lot in a short period of time. I apologize.
That was great. Thank you so much, Adam. We really appreciate that. I just see people are still working on the poll there. If your pension wasn't listed in this list and you chose other, if you'd like to throw your pension fund up in the chat, so we can see, that would be great. So while we're maybe finishing doing that, we're going to just sort of cap Adam's presentation with a quick 5-minute video screening. It's a video that will hit home for kind of all of us as members of the Canada Pension Plan, just to kind of really kind of drive home the moral and human element of this. So I'll let Galen cue that up.
While we're waiting, I will say the Canada Pension Plan owns investments in coal, gas, and oil around the world. And there are a number of areas where they own some pretty terrible companies who are causing a lot of harm. So this is one good example of that.
Dear Canada.
Dear Canada.
Dear Canada.
Dear Canada.
Dear Canada.
Dear Canada.
We're writing to you from the beautiful mountains of Boulder, Colorado.
Land of the Cheyenne, Ute, Arapaho, Dene, and Jicarilla Apache. You probably don't spend much time thinking about our city or communities just like ours all over Colorado.
But we'd like to talk for just a few minutes about how your national pension fund is harming us, our communities, our politics, our health, our environment, and our shared climate.
Whether you know it or not, you are one of 20 million Canadian workers and retirees that benefit from the Canadian Pension Plan.
The corporation that invests money from every paycheck, the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board, or CPPIB, works to make sure your retirement is secure and comfortable.
But unfortunately, your pension savings are being invested in ways that pollute our air, our water, harm the health of our children, and even influence our elections to benefit the oil industry.
You might be surprised to learn that with your savings, the Canada Pension Plan owns a high-risk fracking company called Crestone Peak Resources that is forcing a massive expansion of oil and gas drilling all over Colorado.
The investment managers at the Canada Pension Plan are also executive and board members at Crestone, which is currently one of the largest companies in Colorado that is drilling for oil and gas.
There have been over 1,000 public complaints against Crestone's operations alone. That's more than twice as many as the next 5 oil and gas companies working in Colorado combined.
In fact, Crestone is so unpopular that in Colorado, that 2 counties voted to ban all new fracking projects. Nearly every single elected official in these counties opposed the residential drilling plans proposed by Crestone.
In some cases, oil and gas wells were put within 120 feet of homes and playgrounds. In 2017, a Crestone industrial site released toxic gases just 25 yards from the school playground where I am standing. Would you want a fracking project releasing toxic pollution so close to your children's school?
Oil and gas production in Colorado is one of the leading causes of our poor air quality that consistently fails to meet federal clean air standards.
Crestone's expansion in fracking is especially unacceptable during a respiratory health pandemic.
Residents have filed complaints about toxic fumes, leaks, loud industrial noises, and earthquakes. People have suffered from nausea, nosebleeds, and headaches.
There has been an unusual uptick in health problems like asthma, childhood leukemia, and low birth weight babies near fracking sites.
Crestone is planning to build the largest fracking site in the state with 140 wells here in eastern Boulder County, less than 2 miles from our home. Many days during the summer, like today, our family already suffers from F-grade air quality from ozone created from transportation and fracking emissions.
Fracking has also been linked to an increase in seismic activity. Since fracking development started in my county, we have experienced earthquakes where there had never been earthquakes before.
There have been over 100 fires and explosions at oil and gas sites all over Colorado. For example, in 2017, 2 people were killed when their house exploded due to natural gas leak from a local drilling site. Just last year, a flash fire at a Crestone oil well close to where I'm standing injured 7 people.
Crestone has even worked to influence our statewide elections by donating over $600,000 US into pro-fracking candidates and big oil interest groups. Would you want a foreign oil and gas company pouring hundreds of thousands of dollars into your local elections?
You should also know that Crestone is likely to be a bad investment. Fracking companies all across the U.S. are going bankrupt. Local resistance to their operations is escalating, and the global fight to tackle climate change and cut carbon pollution will only accelerate the decline of natural oil and gas.
Crestone is harming Colorado families. It's putting our health, our children, our communities, and our climate at risk. So please, we are calling on you
to tell Canada Pension Plan to drop its investments in Crestone Peak Resources and other fossil fuel companies.
Tell the Canada Pension Plan to stop investing in fracking next to schools, homes, and playgrounds.
Tell the Canada Pension Plan to protect our health and environment in Colorado.
Tell the Canada Pension Plan to commit to sustainable and green investments.
With love.
With love.
With love.
With love.
With love.
With love.
From your friends and neighbors in Colorado down to the indigenous community.
All right. Tell the Canada Pension Plan. Go on Shift Action and use their letter writing tool. Send a letter. Okay, we are going to switch gears from pensions to banks. So I'm going to turn it over to Matt Lie-Paehlke to discuss our Canadian banks and what the situation is there for the climate.
Hi, I'm Matt. I'm from Climate Pledge Collective. I got my dad credentials right here, so I'm also a big fan of For Our Kids. I'm just going to share my screen, and I have a little presentation, both about sort of the banks lending into fossil fuels and what we can hopefully do about it. I think also it's important to realize that like targeting the banks is a really good complement to divestment, because divestment will affect the company's stock prices, but it sort of is, it's a slower acting thing. It doesn't affect their day-to-day operations necessarily when their stock price goes down. But their ability to get loans from the banks hits them maybe in a different way. So it's good to sort of do both of these things. I'm just going to go to the slide. So this is about Bank Switch, which is a campaign that Climate Pledge Collective has designed to sort of target the Canadian banks. What I'm showing you here is from the Banking on Climate Change report, which was put out by the Rainforest Action Network and BankTrack. It's a fantastic report. It's got a lot of detail. I'm just going to look at a couple slides of it. As Adam was saying, we have to pull out of fossil fuels completely, very rapidly. There's no room for new investment in fossil fuels. But what you can see is that this is since the Paris Agreement. Various banks, the worst in the world, or the most in the world, is JP Morgan Chase, put $260 billion into fossil fuels. But what you can see is that RBC, TD, Scotiabank, Bank of Montreal, and CIBC are all in the sort of top 20 global banks for investments into fossil fuels. And what's really startling is that like Chase and Citi and Bank of America are much larger banks, so that RBC and TD, as a percentage of their total investments and assets, have a lot more stake in fossil fuels. The Banking on Climate Change report also does a score on policies. So what they make this score out of 200, and what they're measuring here is if they have plans to phase out fossil fuel loans in the future, if they have policies about the sort of worst fossil fuels like fracking we just saw, if they have policies about thermal coal. And none of the global banks are doing great on this. 82 out of 200 is the highest score for Crédit Agricole. But the Canadian banks get like between 3 and 0.5 points out of 200, because they're willing to put money into any kind of fossil fuel investment, thermal coal, fracking, Arctic drilling, all of it, and they have just no policies about it at all, basically, is what they found when looking through their like formal policies on fossil fuels. So the way we've designed Bank Switch is with the idea of getting the big five to change their lending policies. In a way, we think this is, I mean, it's great if people switch to credit unions or to smaller banks, but I think you'll have a bigger impact on climate if you can get one or more of the big five banks to change their policies than if maybe a few hundred, a few thousand of us move to smaller banks. That's not going to actually necessarily influence how much funding these fossil fuel companies are getting from the big banks. So we're trying to do it in a way that will make them change their policies. And it's starting to work. There's been a lot of work on this. Climate Pledge Collective is not new to this, or we are new to this, but we're not the first people to be doing it. Toronto 350 has been pressuring the Canadian banks a lot. There's a thing out west called Grow the Record that was having people cut up their bank cards. And the banks also know that the people are aware that they're, there we go. That people are aware of how bad their investments are. So JP Morgan Chase, who saw a lot of pressure from the Stop the Money Pipeline campaign in the US, has finally made an announcement just in October that they're planning to make sure their investments, all of the companies have plans to meet the Paris Climate Accord. RBC also in October announced new restrictions on financing of coal and oil. They were a little bit weak. They were sort of saying, oh, we're not going to invest money into companies that get more than 50% of their revenue from thermal coal. But what happens is a lot of the thermal coal is done by large conglomerates, big mining conglomerates or utility companies. So they actually are able to still invest sort of secondhand into thermal coal in this manner. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how the Bank Switch campaign is designed to work and how you can get involved. We're asking people to contact their branch manager and let them know that they will switch to another bank, the most sustainable bank they can find next April. This is with the idea that we're hoping that they'll make announcements, and if they make a policy announcement that you can agree with, then you might not have to move your money. So it both makes the first step easier, and it has that effect of trying to pressure the banks into changing their actual policies in a way that they might not if you just took your money out and they weren't sure why. My slides are not switching quickly. I don't know why. There we go. So it depends on which bank you're with, but the way to contact your branch manager is to look up your branch, and the contact info is there. For me, I booked an appointment with the client service rep in my branch, and they called me at home, and I talked with them and explained what my concerns were, and then I sent a follow-up email to be passed on to the branch manager that included links to the Banking on Climate Change report. So what we're asking people to do is to sign up on Action Network, and we'll put a link in the chat to that. This will allow us both, if the banks do make some announcements, we'll send out info to everyone who signed up about that. And it also gives us a record of how many people have signed up, which is sort of what will build the momentum for this campaign. The demands that the campaign has, at least what we have in our email templates, are from BankTrack. That's an international organization that's got a sort of across the board demands for banks. And they're asking the banks to clarify their position on the relationship between climate change and fossil fuels, to commit to immediately ending support for all new fossil fuel projects, which I think is the most important one, and to publish a plan to show in the long term how their existing financial relationships can be kept in line with the Paris targets. Of course, when you're contacting your bank, there's a lot of room for you to make your own demands. You might have additional things. There are a lot of problems with banks. They're also, for example, we had the land acknowledgement at the beginning, but the 1492 land back lane issue in Ontario is about a property development, and they're obviously getting money from the banks as well. So it's up to you exactly what you would say to your branch manager and what's a sort of enough for you, but these are the sort of suggested demands we have for your email or phone call. And then why is the campaign designed for like this? So the idea is that we're using the bank structure against them. We're going to branch managers because they don't hear a lot of this kind of sort of political or environmental issue necessarily, and they all have their own views on these issues, and so it's going to strike them a little bit differently. And even, especially if you know a few neighbors, like getting 2 or 3 people at the same branch sending in this call or this email will get the branch manager's attention. It's not the kind of thing they hear every day, in the same way that a high-level PR person or a CEO sort of has already probably tuned this issue out of their mind in some ways. And then the other thing about the asking people to switch in April is that we're hoping to make them compete with each other. So TD Bank or BMO isn't going to be scared of Climate Pledge Collective. They don't really care about us, but they might start to worry that one of the other banks is going to make a big announcement and try to scoop up the people who are worried about this. Because if one of the other banks decides that this is a play they want to make, it's going to come with a lot of marketing money, and it's going to come maybe with their own phone line or way to make switching all your accounts over easily. So the design of it, that's the main reason that we're asking people not to switch right away, but to say they're thinking about switching, is that we want the banks to all start worrying that one of the other ones will make an announcement. And as you saw, RBC has already made an announcement because they don't want to be known as sort of the worst Canadian bank in terms of fossil fuels. So they're aware of this problem. They're aware that it's a brand problem for them, and they're starting to worry about whether. Oh, sorry, I was just reading the questions. That's an interesting one, and we can talk about that. So I'll talk a little bit about existing alternatives. I mean, the main thing is that none of the big 5 Canadian banks are good. They're, in fact, like particularly atrocious in terms of international banks. Are there mid-sized options? National Bank from Quebec is a little bit better. There's something called the UN Declaration on Responsible Banking, which is fairly weak. It requires the banks mostly to be transparent about their fossil fuel investments and fossil fuel risks. National Bank signed it, but none of the other big 5 Canadian banks signed it, even though it doesn't require them to do much except be transparent and honest about their investments. Only National Bank was able to do that. Desjardins is also a little bit better. They've been making some good policy announcements lately, but at the same time, Desjardins is invested, or was, before the Canadian government bought it, invested in TMX. Yeah, so someone says in the chat that Desjardins is a good choice. It's like better than the big 5, but it also has fossil fuel investments. HSBC is an international bank, the Hong Kong Savings Bank. And as you can see here, they're kind of in the middle of the pack in terms of international banks. They get an 18.5 out of 200 for their fossil fuel investment policy. So they're not great, but they're better than the Canadian banks again. The best thing probably is to go with a regional credit union. We directly contacted Alterna and Duca, and both of them have assured us that they don't have any fossil fuel loans or investments. They don't have firm policies about it. It's partly because of the size and the type of loans that they make is mostly to smaller businesses, social enterprises, so that the large fossil fuel companies just aren't even on their radar. But you can be assured that they're outside of your portfolio if you're banking with one of these banks. Kindred is a Christian credit union outside of Kitchener. They have a lot of branches, and they're really interesting because they're like ethical from the ground up. They don't do fossil fuels. They also have firm policies about military investments and weapons. So they're very good and transparent about their investments. In Quebec, you have National Desjardins, as I mentioned, and then there's a lot of small, good credit unions in Quebec. Quebec is kind of the home of credit unions in a way. There are a lot of them there. Out in British Columbia, Van City and CCEC are both like really good. They have like firm fossil fuel policies, and they support actually a lot of environmental stuff and climate action. CCEC was tweeting about the climate strikes and getting people to go and make statements at the municipal climate policy and stuff. So they're very good. I see a couple questions. I think Meridian is a lot like Alterna. They don't have fossil fuel investments, but it's mostly because of their scale. They don't have like a clear policy as far as I'm aware of. And Tangerine is, I was very mad about this. They used to be owned by ING Direct, which is one of the better banks. It's a Dutch bank. It's one of the better banks on fossil fuels, but then they were bought by Scotiabank. So if you're banking with Tangerine, it actually is just Scotiabank again. And then again, in Atlantic and Prairies, there's small credit unions sort of all across Canada. So I'm going to make a closing statement about sort of the best way that you can help with this campaign. Obviously is to sign up. I think there was a link put into the chat. And if not, we can put it in again. And then to just contact people you know who might be willing to do it. I found it actually didn't take that long. You know, you book the appointment online and then they call you at a set time. The amount of time it takes isn't too bad in that way. And then what I've been finding so far is that in terms of the people who have signed up, Climate Pledge Collective has a relatively small social media reach of a few thousand people across Facebook and Twitter and everything. And we weren't getting too many random people that I didn't know through the internet, but we've done some webinars like this. People I know directly, a lot of them are signing up. So the best way to get people, you know, on social media, you can get people to click like or maybe share something, but it's hard to get them to go over to another thing on their window and actually sign up for something and then contact their branch manager. So we'd also ask that if this is a campaign that you think has legs, then we need your help to talk to a few people and get them to also sign up. Because the number of people on that list is really what's gonna maybe get media attention and get the banks thinking about whether they want to make a play for these sustainable customers. Because we know they're out there. We had hundreds of thousands of people come out to the climate strikes. So if we can get even a fraction of those people signing up for this campaign, I really think it has the potential to get the bank's attention. Because there's also a lot of debate inside the banks about whether these are good loans. As Adam was talking about, there's a lot of political risk. The fossil fuel industry is not as good an investment as it used to be. So there's pressure within the banks to pull out of these issues just for risk management reasons. So if we can add to it that they're also still concerned that one of the other banks is going to pick up a lot of new clients, then it really is going to start getting the ball rolling inside the banks. So that's the presentation. I'm happy to answer some questions in more detail later. Thanks, everybody. And yeah, please give it a sign up now and think about who you might be able to share it with. Thank you. Sorry, I talk too fast. I don't know why I do that.
It was great. Thank you so much, Matt. I thought your speaking pace was perfect. I really especially liked your point of, that your campaign is, the Bank Switch campaign is about more than just moving your money out of one of the big five, but actually pressuring banks to change their policies. I thought that was a really kind of powerful thing to think about. So we are, with that, it's a good segue into moving into talking about action. So we definitely encourage you to check out the Bank Switch campaign. The links are in the chat, as well as Shift Action to sign up there and use the letter writing tool to contact your pensions. Both those links are in the chat, and we will be sending them out in a follow-up email. So you'll have that there. And I want to remind you that as we're heading into our Q&A in a few minutes, please write any questions you have into the chat, and we can try to get to them in the Q&A. So if something occurs to you, please just jot it down there, and we'll get to it in just a few minutes. We're going to, I'm going to pass the mic to Lela Bloomer for our kids, who's going to pick up on this taking action piece and talking about taking collective action and what we can do together. So Lela, I will pass it over to you.
Great, thanks. Thanks so much, Brianne. And thanks to Adam and Matt so much. I mean, information is gold on this, and just having people who are well educated about this and able to present that information in a way that's easy to take in is awesome. So thank you so much for that. So as Brianne said, I'm here to sort of build on what Adam and Matt both identified as very concrete and very effective actions for individual parents and grandparents to take, and move into a bit of a discussion about the power of doing those kinds of actions and other actions collectively. So I'd like to start by showing you a little video clip. This is a clip from a group in Guelph from February 14th of this year. And you're going to hear a mum, Megan, who is a member of Fridays for Future Guelph. And she, along with other members of that group, spent Valentine's Day this year visiting the managers of the 5 major Canadian banks that are in downtown Guelph. So I would like to play a short clip of Megan talking about what she was doing and why. So you just bear with me here. I'm going to share my screen and show you just a very quick clip. Okay, so sorry about that. I'll paraphrase what Megan said. Basically, she was walking into the bank, TD Canada Bank, which she had banked at all her life. She started an account there when she was a little girl. Her dad walked with her into the bank, opened an account for her, and she's had that account ever since. And she, as a mom of 3, was looking forward to the day where she'd take her oldest into the bank and do exactly the same thing. So when she went into the manager to see the manager on Valentine's Day this year, she went there to tell them that she would not be doing that this year. And she was really quite distressed about that because it was something that she was looking forward to doing. So quite a compelling story and something that I think a lot of us can relate to. And they're not the only group. So Fridays for Future is obviously not the only group that's tackling divestment of banks and pension plans. There's also a group called Grandmothers Acting to Save the Planet, GASP. and they're in the Halton region, and I think there are a couple of them on the call here tonight. So recently they sent letters to the CEOs of RBC and TD Canada Trust, and they had equally compelling stories. I mean, one of them was a former employee of RBC, and she was appealing directly to the CEO, David McKay, and telling him that, asking him as a parent to really think about what they were asking for, think about the future of their kids, and make decisions based on that. So really compelling stories. And these are the voices that the banks and the pension plans really need to hear. And the more they hear of them, the better. So, I mean, one parent or grandparent walking into a bank might be easy to dismiss. If they walk in there with their kids, they might be a little bit harder to dismiss. If you've got a couple of parents and grandparents walking into a branch of a bank with their kids, it's a little bit harder. So you can see where I'm going with this. A large group of parents and grandparents who are angry and motivated and walk in there with their kids, and all of the money that they've been saving and working hard to invest for their kids' future. That's the kind of power that we have when we act collectively. So there are lots of examples of ways that we can work collectively. Some are better at garnering media attention, and Matt was giving an example of that earlier. Some are better at engaging parents who have really very limited time and capacity. So you can have online petitions, you can have email campaigns, you can have social media campaigns, you can have meetings with decision makers, you can have physical demonstrations, marches, all kinds of things. I mean, typically to be successful, you'll need to use a combination of strategies and also some out of the box thinking. I was thinking about a video like the one we saw earlier. I mean, that really hits a message, makes a message hit home, and is really, really very powerful. So what we'd like to hear from you and others, you who are on the call and others, are, what are the ideas that are going to work to really enable and empower parents and grandparents to take something like this on? I mean, it is one more thing, right? It's one more thing for a lot of people, and it's a really big thing for a lot of people because it touches on what we've traditionally considered part of the security and well-being of our families now and in the future. So it hits really close to home. Quite honestly, that's exactly what climate change is. So it is something that is hitting right at the security and well-being of our families now and in the future. So this is equally big, and it's something we need to tackle together. So with that, I'm interested in hearing some discussion about how we can tackle this together, and looking at developing some plans. We can get back to you with what we hear tonight and what we hear from parents and grandparents over the next month or so, and see if we can't lay out a plan for success. So really looking forward to the discussion. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you so much, Lella. Those are some inspiring stories, especially the idea of sharing the story, I think, which is sort of what For Our Kids is all about, right? Is not just doing something in silence, but letting people know what you're doing and inspiring others with that too. So we're going to move on to the Q&A. Exciting. Please do put your questions into the chat. We want to hear from you. We want to have a discussion. We have excellent presenters, panelists ready and willing to take your questions. So there was one listed just recently during Matt's talk about bank switch. So Matt, I'm going to field this to you first, but the question was, for the bank switch campaign, why not refer to the IPCC targets, which are maybe more adequate than the Paris Agreement targets?
So the demands that we're using are from a group called BankTrack, which is out of Europe. So I do agree that the IPCC targets are stronger, and the level of, okay, so I'm going in circles here. Okay, I think that's a great idea, and I think you should do it in your email to your branch manager to show you have your own thoughts and your own research on it. We chose to use the ones that BankTrack already has to kind of add weight to a campaign that's already out there. But I also really quite like the idea of people making their own personal emails have slightly different demands, because it shows that it's not like a form letter, it's something that people have thought about themselves, and the branch managers will notice that, right? Like if you get 100 emails that all have the same subject line and the same name, it's going to have an impact as well, but it's a bit different if they're all a little bit different and you think, oh, people are coming to this independently.
Thank you. Sorry, fielding questions. Yes, thank you. Yeah, of course, you can always personalize your own demands, right? So I have another question here. It seems to be there's a lot of people on the call who are members of local climate action groups, who are involved in climate action. And so we're wondering, this is to both of you or to all of you, for these kind of local action groups at the local chapter, what is something that they can be doing as a group? So maybe a step beyond sending the letter, or you know, you've moved your money already from a bank to a credit union, and you contacted your bank manager. So I guess it's 2-in-1 question. Is one, as a local group, is there something else that local climate action group can be doing? And the second part of that is, if you've already sent the letter and you've moved your money and you've done all those steps, what next? What more can you do?
I can jump in. You go ahead, Matt.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing is, actually, there's someone in Toronto who's been just picketing outside one of the banks. So just being present and having some sort of a sign, maybe sharing the banking on climate information with people. We also have posters that have the bank's brand names. You can download them. They're just 8.5 by 11 from our website, and put them up. So it has the brand name and then like a little bit of the information about
yes,
money they put in.
Yes, that's right. So, oh yeah, sorry. So
Sorry about that, Matt.
Yeah, I'll just try to find a link to the posters, and then that's a great little activity. And I think also, as I said, if you can get a bunch of people to hit the same branch manager with the emails, I think it has a very different effect than just hearing from one person, because they're like, they might write that off, but if they're like, why am I getting 2-3 emails? So if you just know people in your neighborhood, that if you can just get together 4 or 5 people from one branch, that's going to have a real impact.
Right. Coordinate and conquer.
Yeah, I'll just throw on the pensions are a little the bank campaign is amazing because there are banks everywhere. They're in everybody's community at the local level, and they have a lot of roots in communities. So it's a great idea to sort of show up physically. The pension space is a little trickier in that sense, but there are groups of folks who are grouped by their pension fund. So for example, a group of teachers in a small community can actually physically get together and work together to write letters to the pension fund. That's the kind of thing we've been helping local groups do, as well as running a local workshop to talk about how this is an effective strategy, I think is actually really useful. So spreading on the fact that we've taken action, we need others to take action is really helpful. And as well, local media can be really useful to sort of, if you can write a local op-ed or a letter to the editor, or chime in as ways to draw attention to the fact that this is, getting your investments out of fossil fuels is important, and socializing this concept, because right now we're really trying to crack through a barrier in Canada where there's a lot of resistance to this idea still. There's sort of a mentality in Canada that this is an extreme move and that this needs to be normalized quite a bit. So there's a lot of work there, and just talking to our neighbors and communities about it. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Brian, you touched on it earlier, telling that story. It's really important for people who are taking these actions to share that with their neighbors, with their friends, with the people that they work with the people that they hang out with, go to school with. That's really important because it needs to be seen as something that everybody needs to be involved in, that everyone can do. It's not something that's, that's that radical. It's something that needs to be done, and everyone can do it. So I think that's the big piece.
There was talk in the chat for Ontario teachers, which I am one of them, but to maybe send a note with your child to your kid's teacher, maybe a thank you note because it's a difficult year, but also say, thank you, but can you please send a letter to your pension fund on behalf of your student? So yeah, there's lots of ideas cooking here.
Quickly chime in on that one too, is that we are working with a large and growing group of Ontario teachers. And we're also talking tomorrow to the Fridays for Futures group of students. And there is an idea around students asking their teachers to please contact their pension fund. And we have an open letter from Ontario teachers to the pension fund that teachers can sign on to. So I'll share the link as well for that. It's another online action tool, but if you're an Ontario teacher and you want to sign that letter, that would be really helpful. We're trying to spread that.
Thank you, Adam. I'm getting a couple of questions about some personal investment questions, which I know, Matt and Adam, you're not, maybe particularly poised to speak about. But there's been some people asking about good green mutual funds, Canadian renewable portfolios. So although you can't speak to people's personal financial situations, maybe we might be able to point people in maybe the right direction of where they might find that information. It seems like people are having some trouble maybe finding that info.
I can speak quickly, which is I'm not going to recommend specific investments because it's not my field of expertise, but also a dangerous thing to do for not a financial advisor. But I think what's really important here to remember is these do exist. There are now a number of mutual funds or exchange traded funds that are explicitly carbon free. There are also other funds that are explicitly proactively green or have other social justice screens on them that actively trying to invest in thematic areas that are helpful. If you ask your bank or your credit union or your financial advisor, I would like one of these products, please. They exist out in the world. And if your financial advisor can't give you clear advice on where to get them, then this is another useful piece of activism, which is to say, look, if you can't provide this for me, I'm going to find someone who can, because there are lots of financial advisors out there now who have those products for you. So it's actually incredibly helpful just to ask the question. And I'm hearing already from a lot of financial people that I'm speaking to that they're hearing this all over the place, all of a sudden from their clients. So please do go out and ask for that, specifically using the words fossil free, not ESG thematic. Like there's a lot of soft language that doesn't have a hard and fast meaning. So be careful with your language, but I would strongly recommend you go ask.
Thank you. I have a question here that I missed before. I'm sorry about that. Someone is interested to know how to do the Bank Switch campaign with online banks that don't have a physical location.
Yeah, this one's a little bit tricky. You can go higher up in the bank. Obviously, there's like financial ombudsmans for each of the bank. I don't know exactly what your client service relationship is. Like I know you can get email or chat support. I think the best thing is I would recommend you email me and we would walk through it together because I've had this question before. You can tell me like what your options are or whatever, and we can try to figure out what the way to do it is. And I would love to have a little thing on the blog about your experience because this is not the first time that that's come up. But yeah, like some of the online banks, it's very hard to like send them a message that isn't like from a drop-down button or whatever. So yeah, let's get in touch and talk through how you would go about that because I would love to share that experience.
Thank you. Yes. There's some talk here about coordinating a date for kind of everyone to do this at the same time. And Carolyn's asking a good question here, which is asking individual branch managers might feel a little bit maybe sporadic and spread out. And they're wondering if there is sort of a singular customer service email for the banks. So if 100 of us are with TD, for example, instead of being with all speaking to all different branch managers, if there's sort of one line that everyone could tap into, so you're sending the same message to the same place, if that makes sense, if that exists, or if the individual bank manager is the way to go?
Yeah, I think it's very hard to get a real person in sort of the like, if you call TD, you get like a lot of menu options and that kind of thing, like on the open service line. I think the ombudsman is worth considering. They're mostly supposed to be about like if you think your bank defrauded you or they failed to deposit your check or something like that, you go to them. So it's outside of their wheelhouse, and they're probably going to like ignore it based on it being outside of their required responsibilities. But I think they would notice if they got 100 emails or something all about this issue, and they might have to report it to someone else in the bank. So if people are into that, we could definitely, I could set up automated emails to the ombuds people. It's at least worth, yeah, again, email me about this and we can think about it and talk about it more. Because I debated a lot about whether you want to go to individual branch managers or someone higher up, but there's value in both. So yeah, let's talk more about that.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, when in doubt, why not do both, right? Especially if
Yeah.
if the latter is as simple as sort of sending a copy and paste email, right? But I think it is, I think too, for many of us, and maybe Matt, you can attest to this, the in-person meeting or the phone call is a little bit scarier and a little bit higher stakes, right?
Put it off for a while myself, because I don't even like ordering a pizza on the phone. I'm like, ugh. I mean, I'll do it, but it takes a little mental preparation to make a phone call to someone you don't already know. So, but I think it also has more impact for that reason, right? That you're actually talking face to face with a real person who maybe has their own family, their own concerns about climate change. So it'll percolate throughout the bank that way, in a different way than sort of a mass email will.
Mm-hmm. And Adam, maybe sort of a similar sort of question for you is, with pension funds, which are so huge, how to kind of break through that communication? I know I've had many experiences where I've sent the letter and I get a super generic and disappointing response months later, and then I try to follow up again, but you're not really sure what to say, and you kind of just feel like you're not actually being heard.
Yeah, I mean, it's challenging because these are big institutions and they technically work for you, and they're literally hired to manage your money. Like, it's your money. So it's a very service-based position that they find themselves in, but they're not used to being contacted. So what we recommend is actually asking questions with real answers, so that they have to respond to you with something that you've specifically asked them for information for. And when they provide that information, we know, in the case of most Canadian pension funds, if you ask them, say, what are your measurable goals for shifting money out of fossil fuels into climate solutions, something like that, they'll write back with fairly generic, useless information. You write them back and say, that's not the question I asked. I specifically wanted this information. Do you have it? Can you please tell me where I can find, so you actually have a concrete thing to grab onto, because they're really going to give you some corporate speak sometimes. And what we found is really effective is when we talk about specific investments that the fund has made. And a good example is an Ontario Pension OP Trust, which is for OPSU union members. They recently invested in a gas plant in Alberta. And we had one of the, there's actually a growing group of beneficiaries, but of pension holders. One of them wrote a letter to the OP Trust and said, what are you doing? This is not a green investment. I'm very upset about this. And we saw that their letter actually ping-ponged all the way up to the management level and back down again. They had, I have to send this to my manager, and we got information from the investment team. And so it may look like you're getting a generic response, but it's actually caused quite a bit of internal unrest within the fund. They're actually going out and trying to find out answers to the question you've asked. And sometimes they do real work. They create whole new programs just to answer your question. So it may not look like you're having an impact, but you are. And so far, that's been Shift's impact. Like, we're not getting clear pledges to phase out fossil fuels yet, but we know that a lot of the funds are now much more reticent to take on new fossil fuel investments than they used to be. So we are making progress. They're just not showing it to us. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you. That's encouraging. Just looking at the time here, it's late for some of us in the East. I'm wondering if we should get close to wrapping up. And I think tonight's discussion was really wonderful. Some really good information to sit with and to think about there. And some really interesting ideas sparked in the chat. I like this idea of coordinating efforts. So that's something we will definitely be following up with. I would just like to quickly share my screen to cap us off here. So I just wanted to say a huge thank you to our presenters, Adam Scott, Matt Lie-Paehlke, and Lila Bloomer. It was very interesting, and it was so wonderful to have such experts kind of really lay out all these facts for us in a really digestible, accessible way. Thank you to all the participants for your engaging conversation in the chat and your questions that really kept that Q&A going. Thank you, Galen Armstrong, for doing the tech support. It was a wonderfully smooth evening. Well done, sir. Very good. Thank you to the co-hosts to help promote this event. We appreciate you getting the word out there. And again, like I said, we will be in touch over the next couple of days with an email. We will include all of the links, all the resources, all the contacts to get you linked up with us and to take action and to learn more and to get involved. If you would like to get in touch with us in the meantime, or at any time really, please email us at toronto@4kids.ca, or you can go to the 4Kids website and check us out there. So thank you very much, everybody.